The moment my stepfather Richard grabbed the microphone at my wedding reception, I knew something terrible was about to happen. The way he swayed slightly, his third whiskey sour clutched in his left hand, that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times before, it all screamed disaster. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. I'm Millie Hatfield, I'm 29 years old, and what should have been the happiest day of my life turned into a nightmare that would ultimately lead to sweet, unexpected justice. Before I continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Thank you. Richard wasn't supposed to give a speech. We'd specifically planned the toast order, David's best man, my maid of honor, and David's father. But Richard had other plans. He tapped the microphone 3 times, that awful feedback screech making everyone wince, and began what he called his honest blessing for the marriage. He started with backhanded compliments about how I'd finally found someone willing to marry me despite my complicated family history. Then he launched into stories about my mother's struggles with depression after my father left, making it sound like mental illness was something shameful, something that made our family less than. My mother had passed 3 years ago, and here was this man, using her memory as a weapon at my wedding. The room went silent except for the sound of my mother-in-law Margaret's pearls clicking as she shifted uncomfortably. She already thought I wasn't good enough for her precious David, coming from a broken home, as she liked to whisper at family gatherings. Richard was just confirming all her prejudices. But Richard wasn't done. He announced to all 150 guests that he'd been bankrolling this little fantasy wedding and that he was cutting off the open bar immediately because he'd already spent enough on my pipe dreams. He actually used those words, pipe dreams, to describe my marriage to David. Then came the real kicker. He said I should be grateful he'd kept me fed and housed after my mother died, like I was some stray dog he'd taken in out of pity. The wedding coordinator looked at me in horror. The bartender actually stopped mid-pour. My cousin Jessica dropped her shrimp cocktail, and it landed with a splat that somehow echoed in the silent ballroom. I stood up slowly, my white dress rustling in the quiet. David reached for my hand, but I gently pulled away. I walked to the microphone where Richard stood, still smirking, probably expecting me to cry or plead. Instead, I smiled, the same smile I'd perfected during years of his condescension, took the microphone from his hand, and said simply that the reception was over, and everyone was welcome to take home the centerpieces. Then I walked out, just walked right out of my own wedding reception, my train trailing behind me like a queen leaving court. David followed, of course, wonderful man that he is, but not before his groomsman Marcus accidentally knocked Richard's whiskey all over his rented tux. Marcus always did have perfect timing. What Richard didn't know, what he'd never bothered to learn in his arrogance, was that my mother had been a brilliant software engineer. Those pipe dreams he mocked, I'd inherited her analytical mind, her attention to detail, and most importantly, her habit of keeping meticulous records. The company Richard now ran, the one that paid for his country club membership and his ridiculous midlife crisis Porsche, was built entirely on my mother's patents and code. 3 days after the wedding disaster, while David and I were supposed to be in Bermuda for our honeymoon, I was instead sitting in my living room in my pajamas, eating ice cream straight from the container. Ben & Jerry's Cherry Garcia, if you're wondering, because if you can't have chocolate therapy after your stepfather ruins your wedding, when can you? That's when Eddie Chen knocked on my door. Eddie had been our wedding photographer, but more importantly, he'd been my mother's colleague 20 years ago when they'd worked together at Tech Innovations. He stood there with his camera bag and a manila envelope that would change everything. Eddie told me he'd been struggling with whether to come forward, but after witnessing Richard's display, he couldn't stay quiet anymore. My mother had given him something to keep safe, something she'd told him to give me only if Richard ever went too far. Well, if ruining my wedding wasn't too far, I don't know what would be. Inside the envelope was a key to a safety deposit box at First National Bank, along with a sticky note in my mother's handwriting. For my brilliant daughter. Trust your instincts, love. The truth always surfaces. David wanted to come with me to the bank, but he was stuck in damage control mode. His mother, Margaret, had been calling nonstop, alternating between sympathy and subtle suggestions that maybe we should have just eloped to avoid family drama, as if Richard's behavior was somehow my fault. David, bless him, was trying to manage her while supporting me, though I could see him struggling. He'd grown up in a family where conflict meant quiet disappointment and passive-aggressive Christmas cards, not public humiliation at wedding receptions. The safety deposit box contained 3 things: my mother's real will, a USB drive, and a leather journal filled with her notes. The will was dated just 2 months before her death, properly witnessed and notarized. It stated clearly that everything, the house, the company, the patents, was to transfer to me on my 30th birthday. That was only 6 months away. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean infuriating. Richard had produced a different will after her death, one that left him in control of everything for Millie's benefit until I turned 35. His version was dated a week before she died, when she'd been heavily medicated in the hospital. I remembered that week. She could barely hold a pen, let alone sign legal documents. The USB drive contained something even more valuable: email correspondence between Richard and his lawyer discussing how to restructure the inheritance for maximum benefit. There were drafts of the fake will, discussions about which witnesses would be cooperative, and most damningly, Richard's own admission that my mother had never agreed to any of it. Richard's company, Hatfield Technologies, he'd even kept my mother's maiden name for the credibility, had grown from a small consulting firm to a multi-million-dollar operation, all based on her revolutionary AI algorithms. The patents she'd filed, the code she'd written during late nights while I did homework at the kitchen table, had become the backbone of supply chain management systems used by major corporations. And then there was Brittany. Oh, Brittany. Richard's girlfriend, who at 24 was 5 years younger than me, had been at the wedding wearing a dress that cost more than some people's cars. She'd actually tried to catch the bouquet, her acrylic nails gleaming like talons as she pushed past my college roommates. She'd been posting the whole disaster on Instagram, thinking she was so clever with her hashtags: hashtag wedding drama, hashtag new money, hashtag trophy girlfriend life. The internet, as you might imagine, had not been kind to her in the comments. My phone had been buzzing constantly since the wedding. At first it was concerned relatives and friends, but by day 3, Richard had started calling. 1 call, then 5, then 15. By that evening, I had 31 missed calls from him. The voicemails progressed from angry demands that I apologize for making a scene, to slightly panicked requests to discuss the family business, to outright threatening legal action for defamation, as if repeating his own words could be defamation. Herbert Goldstein was 78 years old, technically retired, and absolutely thrilled to hear from me. He'd been my mother's lawyer before Richard convinced her to switch to his friend, who gave them a family discount. Herbert had never trusted Richard, and being proved right after all these years seemed to energize him more than his afternoon espresso. His office smelled like old books and peppermint, and his assistant was none other than Ashley Morrison, my high school's mean girl who used to make fun of my hand-me-down clothes. Karma has a sense of humor, because Ashley took one look at me, recognized me immediately, and said, "Oh, thank God you're here. We've been waiting for you to figure it out. Your mom was brilliant, and that man is a leech." Turns out Ashley had grown up, gotten her paralegal certification, and developed a strong sense of justice. She'd also been secretly copying files for 3 years, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Herbert laid out the situation with the dramatic flair of a man who'd been waiting for one last big case. The real will was rock solid. The fake one? Full of holes. The witnesses Richard had used included his golf buddy who'd been in Florida that week and a notary whose license had expired 2 years before the supposed signing. It was sloppy, arrogant work. Exactly what you'd expect from Richard. But we had a problem. Richard had already transferred most of the liquid assets into company investments, and the house had been refinanced twice. Getting everything back would require proving fraud, and that meant we needed more evidence. Herbert suggested we look into the company's contracts, particularly the big government deal Richard had been bragging about for months. If you're enjoying this wild ride, my friends, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Your support truly means everything to me, and it helps other people find these stories too. Ashley had been doing some digging of her own. She'd found out that Richard's business partner, Joaquin Reeves, had been trying to exit the partnership for a year, but Richard kept blocking him with various legal maneuvers. Joaquin had even hired his own forensic accountant to review the books, but Richard had threatened to destroy Joaquin's reputation if he went public with any misunderstandings about the company's ownership structure. The government contract was the key. It was worth $50 million over 5 years, but it required clean ownership of all intellectual property. The patents couldn't have any disputes or clouded ownership. Richard had been filing paperwork claiming sole invention rights, conveniently leaving out that my mother's name was on all the original patents. I made an anonymous call to Richard's biggest competitor, Innovative Solutions, suggesting they might want to look into the patent history of Hatfield Technologies before the government made their final decision. Then I called the Government Accountability Office's fraud hotline, just to be thorough, you understand. The best part? Richard's paranoia was already in overdrive. According to my Aunt Sharon, Richard's own sister, who'd always been kind to me despite her brother, he'd installed new security cameras at the office, hired a private investigator to follow me, and started accusing employees of being spies. He'd even fired his longtime secretary because she'd asked about discrepancies in the patent documentation. Meanwhile, Brittany was living her best life, completely oblivious to the storm brewing. She'd posted photos from her spa weekend, her shopping spree at Neiman Marcus, and her new Tesla, all captioned with gems like CEO's girlfriend perks and building an empire. The woman couldn't spell entrepreneur, but was already calling herself one on LinkedIn. Herbert's assistant Ashley turned out to be a social media genius. She'd been screenshotting everything, creating a digital trail of Richard and Brittany's spending sprees, while the company was technically in financial distress. Every purchase made with company funds, every business dinner at 5-star restaurants with no actual business conducted, every luxury vacation written off as a corporate retreat, Ashley had receipts for all of it. The universe has a sense of timing, I'll give it that. The very morning I learned about the government contract's requirements, Richard posted on LinkedIn about taking Hatfield Technologies to the next level, with a photo of himself standing in front of my mother's portrait in the office lobby, the same portrait he'd wanted to remove last year because it was outdated. The comment section was already filling with congratulations from people who had no idea what was about to unfold. Joaquin Reeves reached out to me through Herbert. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place Richard would never be caught dead in because they didn't have valet parking. Joaquin was exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from fighting a losing battle for too long. He told me Richard had been cooking the books for years, moving money between accounts to hide the fact that he'd been using company funds for personal expenses. But here's where Richard's ego became his downfall. He'd been so confident in his control that he'd put everything in writing. Emails directing Joaquin to falsify reports, text messages about hiding assets, even a recorded phone call where Richard explicitly said my mother's patents were technically the company's property now, and I would never be smart enough to figure it out anyway. Joaquin had everything documented, but he'd been afraid to act because Richard had dirt on him too. A minor tax issue from years ago that Richard had blown up into a potential career ender. But with the government contract on the line and my evidence about the patents, Joaquin finally had leverage. We coordinated our attack like a chess match. First, Joaquin's forensic accountant would submit their findings to the Government Contract Review Board. Then I would file my claim on the patents with the U.S. Patent Office, showing my mother's original work and my rightful inheritance. Finally, Herbert would file an emergency injunction preventing Richard from signing any contracts on behalf of Hatfield Technologies. The timeline was critical. The government contract final review was in 1 week. Richard had already scheduled a celebration party at the country club, complete with champagne fountain and a band. Brittany had bought a new dress for the occasion, a $3,000 sequined number that she'd posed with on Instagram, captioning it, "Future Mrs. CEO ready to celebrate." Richard's paranoia was reaching comic levels. According to the office gossip network, which Ashley had thoroughly infiltrated, he'd started making employees sign new NDAs every morning, installed keystroke loggers on all computers, and hired 3 different private investigation firms to watch each other. He'd even accused the janitor of being a corporate spy because the man had asked about the portrait of my mother. The irony was delicious. Richard, who'd built his empire on my mother's genius, couldn't even understand the basic code she'd written. He'd hired a team of engineers to maintain and update the systems, but none of them really grasped the elegant simplicity of her original algorithms. They'd been patching and bandaging problems for years, creating a mess of spaghetti code that barely functioned. Meanwhile, I'd spent my teenage years learning programming from my mother, understanding not just the what, but the why of her innovations. Richard's emergency family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at his house. Technically my mother's house, but I wasn't ready to push that button just yet. The group text he sent was a masterpiece of manipulation. Need all family members present to discuss Millie's recent unstable behavior and its impact on our family's reputation. Coffee and pastries will be served. Unstable behavior. The man who'd humiliated me at my wedding was calling me unstable. It was like the pot calling the kettle beige. Not even black, just beige, because Richard couldn't even get his metaphors right. I arrived 15 minutes late, on purpose, wearing my mother's favorite blazer and carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to her. The living room was full. Richard's sister Sharon looking uncomfortable, various cousins who'd driven in from neighboring states, my mother's elderly Aunt Ruth who'd flown in from Phoenix, and surprisingly David's mother Margaret, who Richard had apparently invited to witness the intervention. Richard stood by the fireplace like he was about to deliver a State of the Union address. Brittany sat on the arm of his chair, wearing what I can only describe as business casual meets Vegas showgirl. A blazer with nothing underneath but a lace bralette, because subtlety was never her strong suit. Richard launched into his prepared speech about my vindictive behavior following a harmless wedding toast, how I was trying to destroy the family business out of spite, and how he was considering having me evaluated for mental health issues, just like my poor mother, he added with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. That's when I opened the briefcase. The click of the latches was surprisingly loud in the hushed room. I pulled out copies of everything: the real will, the forged documents, the email evidence, the patent records, and a special surprise, Richard's tax returns showing he'd been claiming my mother's patents as his own inventions for tax breaks. But the real showstopper was what I'd discovered just that morning. Richard hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been managing Aunt Ruth's retirement fund and had borrowed $200,000 for a temporary business investment that was somehow never repaid. He'd convinced Cousin Michael to invest his kids' college funds in a subsidiary company that existed only on paper. He'd even taken out loans using Sharon's house as collateral without telling her. The room erupted. Aunt Ruth, despite being 84 and usually sweet as pie, stood up and called Richard something I can't repeat here, but it rhymed with trucking fastard. Michael looked like he was about to throw up. Sharon went pale, then red, then a concerning shade of purple. My cousin Todd, bless his millennial heart, was live tweeting the entire meltdown. His commentary included gems like, "Uncle Dick just got exposed harder than my freshman year Facebook photos," and Auntie Millie came with receipts like a CVS shopping trip. The tweets went viral within hours, but we didn't know that yet. Richard tried to regain control, shouting about family loyalty and how I was twisting everything. That's when Brittany, sweet, vapid Brittany, made her fatal error. She laughed and said, "Come on, Rich, just pay them off like you did with that accountant last year." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Todd stopped typing. Richard turned to Brittany with a look of pure panic. She, realizing her mistake, tried to backtrack. "I mean, the accountant you helped with his mortgage, as a gift, from the company." Aunt Sharon, finding her voice, asked very quietly which accountant and why they needed to be paid off. Richard's stammering non-answer told everyone everything they needed to know. David's mother, Margaret, who'd been silent this whole time, stood up and walked over to me. I expected another lecture about bringing drama to her family. Instead, she said, "Millie, dear, I owe you an apology. I've misjudged everything. This man is a criminal, and you've shown more grace than I would have." Then she turned to Richard and added, "You disgust me." That performance at the wedding wasn't about Millie. It was about you being a pathetic, insecure little man who couldn't stand to see someone else happy. Coming from Margaret, who usually expressed strong emotions by slightly pursing her lips, this was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Monday morning arrived like Christmas, if Christmas involved schadenfreude and legal documents. At 9 a.m. sharp, the Government Accountability Office announced they were suspending the contract review, pending an investigation into credible allegations of intellectual property fraud. By 9:30, Richard's company email had blown up with panicked messages from investors. Joaquin, finally free to act, filed his lawsuit at 10 a.m. He didn't just want out of the partnership. He wanted damages for fraud, emotional distress, and defamation. His lawyer, it turned out, was Herbert's former partner who'd been waiting 20 years to stick it to Richard for a golf club incident I didn't even want to know about. By noon, 3 major clients had pulled their contracts, citing concerns about company stability and leadership ethics. The 4th client, a Fortune 500 company, sent their legal team to the office to conduct an emergency audit. They arrived to find Richard trying to shred documents, while Brittany stuffed hard drives into her oversized Hermes bag. The banks moved faster than anyone expected. The loans Richard had taken out using the patents as collateral were suddenly a problem, since the patent's ownership was in dispute. First National froze the company accounts. Commerce Bank called in their credit line. Even the company credit cards stopped working, which Brittany discovered when she tried to pay for her lunch at the country club and had to call a friend to bail her out. The house of cards was collapsing, and Richard was standing in the middle of it, still trying to convince everyone it was just a misunderstanding. He called an emergency board meeting, forgetting that half the board members were my mother's former colleagues who'd been keeping quiet out of respect for her memory. They were done being quiet. The afternoon brought my favorite moment of the entire saga. Brittany, realizing the gravy train had derailed, tried to salvage something from the wreckage. She went to Richard's office to grab her jewelry from the safe, jewelry he'd bought with company funds and written off as client entertainment. She found the safe empty. Richard had already pawned everything to pay for the lawyers he'd hired that morning. The resulting screaming match could be heard 3 floors down. Brittany called Richard every name in the book and several that weren't in any book I'd read. She threw his golf trophies out the window. They were all participation trophies anyway. She dumped his protein shakes on his car seats. Then she posted a breakup announcement on Instagram. Single again. Turns out he was broker than broke. You're just a new beginnings. And he sugar daddy wanted. No, not my circus, not my monkeys. Richard's country club membership was revoked by 5 p.m. Apparently, bouncing a $50,000 event deposit check is frowned upon in those circles. His golf buddies, the same ones who'd laughed at his wedding toast, suddenly didn't know him. The club president actually called me to apologize for any distress their former member had caused, which was code for, "Please don't sue us. We had no idea he was using stolen money." That evening, the local news picked up Todd's tweets. The story of the wedding toast disaster had gone viral over the weekend, and now the business collapse was trending. The headline read, "Local CEO's wedding toast leads to company collapse, federal investigation." They even had video from the wedding. Turns out the videographer had kept rolling during Richard's speech, thinking it was planned. The footage was damning. By midnight, Richard had sent me 31 voicemails, each more desperate than the last. They ranged from threats of legal action to attempts at guilt-tripping about family loyalty to outright begging. The last one was just him crying. I didn't feel bad. Well, maybe a little bad for his liver, which had probably processed more whiskey that day than in the previous month. Tuesday, 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because that's when my Ring doorbell started going crazy. Richard was at my front door and he was absolutely plastered, not just drunk. We're talking about the kind of intoxicated where you think you can fight a mailbox and win. He'd apparently taken an Uber to my house after the driver refused to take him to 3 other addresses, including his lawyer's house and, randomly, a Waffle House. He was pounding on the door, shouting about how this was his house anyway, how my mother had promised him everything, how I was an ungrateful brat who needed to learn respect. He had a stack of papers with him, the forged will, some fabricated receipts, and what looked like a crayon drawing of a contract. The man had literally brought kindergarten-level forgeries to a legal gunfight. David tried to reason with him through the ring speaker, but Richard started threatening to break down the door with a garden gnome. My garden gnome, the one my mother had painted to look like a little wizard. That was the last straw. Our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had already called 911. She'd been watching the whole thing through her window with her cat, both of them equally scandalized. She later told me she'd been waiting 3 years to have a legitimate reason to call the cops on Richard after he'd complained about her wind chimes. The police arrived to find Richard trying to jimmy the lock with a credit card, a declined credit card. Because the universe has a sense of poetry, he immediately started shouting about his rights, how he owned this house, how I was a squatter in his property. He shoved the forged documents at the officers, not realizing one of them was Officer Martinez, whose mother had worked with mine at Tech Innovations years ago. Officer Martinez took one look at the documents, noticed they were dated 3 different years in 3 different places on the same page, and asked Richard if he'd been drinking. Richard's response? "I've been drinking success, officer. This is my house. I demand you arrest her for trespassing in my house." Then Richard made the fatal mistake of trying to push past the officers to get to my door. That's when things got interesting. Turns out Richard had more than just alcohol in his system. He'd apparently taken what Brittany later described on her Instagram story as confidence pills, which I'm pretty sure weren't prescribed by any legitimate doctor. The officers cuffed him for attempted breaking and entering, public intoxication, and assault on a police officer, though honestly, his attempt to push Officer Martinez was more like an aggressive lean. As they were putting him in the car, he started listing all the important people he knew who would have their badges. The list included 2 retired mayors, a fictional senator, and oddly, Judge Judy. But here's where it gets really good. And while searching Richard for weapons, standard procedure, they found a USB drive in his pocket. Richard, in his infinite drunken wisdom, had been carrying around the original files he'd used to forge my mother's will, including a Word document hilariously titled, "Real Will Final Use This One Doc." David's mother, Margaret, had been staying in our guest room since the family meeting, not wanting to miss any developments. She came out in her robe and slippers to watch Richard being arrested, sipping tea from my mother's favorite mug like she was watching a British drama. She actually waved at him as the police car drove away. The police report was a masterpiece. It included Richard's claim that he was a sovereign citizen who didn't recognize their authority, his attempt to bribe them with a company check he couldn't cover, and his final declaration that he would buy the entire police department and turn it into a parking lot. Officer Martinez noted that the suspect seemed confused about basic reality. The local news had somehow already arrived. Mrs. Patterson might have called them, though she denies it while smiling. The footage of Richard being led away in handcuffs, still shouting about his rights and his house, would become what the internet calls an instant classic. Someone set it to circus music and it got 2 million views on TikTok. The courtroom was packed. 3 weeks after his arrest, Richard faced a judge who happened to be the Honorable Patricia Winters, a woman who'd gone to law school with my mother and had 0 tolerance for document fraud. Richard's lawyer, the 3rd one he'd hired after the first 2 quit, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, possibly including active volcano. The criminal charges were just the appetizer. The main course was the civil case, where Herbert absolutely destroyed Richard's defense. Every forged document was examined, every fraudulent transfer exposed, every lie unraveled. Richard tried to claim he'd been protecting my interests, that my mother had verbally agreed to everything. Judge Winters asked him if he had any witnesses to these verbal agreements. Richard suggested they could use a Ouija board to ask my mother. The judge was not amused. The verdict was swift and brutal. Richard was found guilty of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The criminal penalties included 2 to 5 years in prison and restitution of all stolen assets. The civil judgment restored everything to me: the company, the house, the patents, and damages for emotional distress. The judge even added punitive damages for what she called particularly egregious abuse of fiduciary duty. Richard's face went through every shade of pale when he realized he'd lost everything, but the best part was when Judge Winters addressed him directly. "Mr. Garrett, you stood at this young woman's wedding and humiliated her, claiming she should be grateful for your charity. The only charity here was her mother's love for you, which you repaid with theft and betrayal. The court hopes you use your time in custody to reflect on the actual meaning of family." I took over Hatfield Technologies the next day. The employees who'd been living in fear of Richard's paranoid management actually applauded when I walked in. I rehired his secretary with a raise and an apology. Joaquin became my business partner, a real partner with actual contracts and everything legal. We got the government contract after all, once I proved the patents were legitimately mine. The company portrait wall got a makeover. Richard's photo came down, replaced with an expanded portrait of my mother. Underneath, I added a plaque with her favorite quote, "Innovation requires imagination, but success requires integrity." David and I finally took our honeymoon to Bermuda, as originally planned, but this time with a much nicer suite paid for by the settlement. His mother, Margaret, came to the airport to see us off, bringing champagne and an apology card that made me cry. She's become fiercely protective of me now, telling everyone at her book club how her daughter-in-law is a CEO who took down a corrupt man with brilliant strategic thinking. Richard's prison emails started after a week. They went straight to my lawyer. He's apparently found religion, or at least found the chapel has air conditioning. He works in the library now, which seems fitting, surrounded by books about laws he broke. Brittany tried to write a tell-all book called Gold Diggers Regret My Life with a Con Man, but since she'd signed an NDA back when she thought Richard had money, she couldn't publish it without paying damages she couldn't afford. Last I heard, she was dating a cryptocurrency influencer who definitely isn't running a Ponzi scheme, according to his YouTube channel. The wedding reception do-over happened 6 months later. Same venue, same guests, minus Richard, but this time with toasts that actually celebrated love instead of tearing it down. Aunt Ruth gave a beautiful speech about my mother's strength living in me. Even Todd managed to say something heartfelt without mentioning Twitter once. My mother's AI algorithm just won an Industry Innovation Award. I accepted it on her behalf, wearing her blazer, the one she wore when she first pitched the idea that would build an empire. An empire Richard tried to steal but could never truly understand. I keep one voicemail from that night of 31 calls, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder. In it, Richard says, "I'll never be half the business person he is." He was right. I'm twice the person he ever was because I learned from the best. My mother didn't just leave me patents and code. She left me the knowledge that true success isn't about taking from others, but building something that lasts. The company is thriving. The house is peaceful. The wizard garden gnome stands guard by the front door, unbroken and unbowed, just like the women who painted it and the daughter who inherited her strength.